see Danny. Why don't you come up? Daniel is the Deputy Forest Supervisor on the Angeles National Forest. He's got a couple of things that he'd like to say, and then we're going to turn it over to the forest safety officers to discuss some of the logistics, etc.
Thank you, Hugh, and welcome everybody. Tom Contreras, the Forest Supervisor, requested he is not able to be here today, but unfortunately he had another meeting he had to attend, and so he gave me the task of welcoming you. And as I walked in the door, I just saw this lines, of folks standing there signing up. And the only time you ever see lines is when there's something good going on or something free. So, and so anyway, so it was great to see this. And this is an opportunity that very rarely comes around when you have an opportunity to share ideas and thoughts with colleagues and mentors and others. And so this is a great opportunity. And so we're extremely happy here that you guys chose to come here to the Angeles National Forest. So on behalf of all the employees of the Angeles National Forest, we welcome you here and we hope that it is a wonderful week. So thank you all.
Good afternoon, I'm Tracy McGuff, the Fire Training Officer on the Forest and the Facility Manager for our new training center here. This is the first large conference we've had, so you guys are our guinea pigs. We're extremely happy to see everybody here. Looking for feedback so we can make sure we're doing things right and pick up on some things we may have missed. So I'm going to go over just some logistics for the facilities here with you. There are sign-in sheets, which everybody knows if you saw the lines. Just asking you to help keep it clean. We have recycling over there. You could separate that for us. The general standard issue is cell phones. If they don't mention it, put them on vibrate or silent or whatever. The SO building will be open. That door directly across from the courtyard will be open for you guys so you can walk through there tomorrow during lunch. Instead of walking all the way around, it will be a shortcut for you to get out if you want to walk to any of the restaurants. And we will have a list of that. Ryan, Carrie, my awesome assistant right there, Ryan Carey. If you need anything for the next 2 days, that'll be your first stop, and we'll probably take care of it for you. For smoking, there is a bench outside there by the parking lot. That is the designated smoking area. Watch your speed throughout the compound. The parking for the training center is at the far end. I'm sure you saw the signs when you came in. However, if you are a carpool, you are allowed to park in this front lot in the carpool spots. So take advantage of that. It's a lot shorter walk. Temperature in here, it was warm this morning. We turned it way down. There's going to be a lot of people in here, so just let us know if the temperature isn't working, and we'll turn it down as much as we can. But a lot of this is naturally controlled, so we'll do the best we can with it. Let us know. We do have coffee over there. Any small donation would be appreciated since we have to buy that outside of the government funds. Fire exits. This is where Ron's going to help me out if I miss anything. Ron Ashdale is our forest safety officer. The doors you came in, this side door, or out these side doors through the pavilion are all ways to get out of the building. If there's smoke in here, the fire alarms will go off. If the fire alarm is pulled in that building, ours will also go off. The evacuation area where we all want to meet is right in front of the warehouse next to us, standing right up there on the pavement. We have an AED and a first aid kit in the back there. We have a fire extinguisher on that wall and a fire extinguisher on that wall by the back door. Again, we'll have a big list of lunchbox for you. Did I miss anything, Ryan? Remember his name, Ryan. Big tall guy, can't miss him. Goofy smile all the time. He'll do anything to help you. He's an awesome guy. Did I miss anything? Oh, the JHA. For those of you going out in the field, I believe tomorrow they'll be going over JHA for you. Again, welcome. We're so glad to have you here. Again, this is the first large group of any kind that we've had. We've had fire training so far, and that's been it. And we just got the AD finished last week. Brand new. So please give us any feedback that can help us make this better. Appreciate it. Yeah.
What about meeting for the anything that we bought?
Yeah, for fire, earthquake, anything will be in front of that warehouse next to us. That's the general collection point for human beings. Any questions, anything else? Okay, thanks a lot, hope you have a great conference.
So my name is Hugh Safford. I'm the regional ecologist for the Forest Service. I actually live in Davis and work in the Bay Area and mostly in the Sierra Nevada, and it's always a real pleasure to be down here in Southern California. I just wanted to provide a few minutes of opening notes so we could make it clear to everyone here why we're here, how we got here, and where we hope to go after this meeting is over. You know, by its nature and by its name, the Forest Service is a very forest-centric organization. There are, probably gonna get this wrong, but I think there's about 155 national forests, although a lot of them get managed as sort of double or triple units. And there are 20 national grasslands, but there aren't any national shrublands. And the closest thing that we've got to national shrublands, of course, are the Southern California National Forest. I think that more than about 50% of the land area that's still occupied by wildland vegetation in Southern California is occupied by chaparral. And human interactions with vegetation in Southern California seem to be dominated by interactions with chaparral and some other shrubland types. Whether we're talking about chaparral fires, floods and mudslides by otherwise chaparral-dominated bird landscapes, urban expansion into chaparral and the coastal sage shrub, loss of biodiversity, and so on. Forest Service strategic priorities these days tend to focus on green things, not just our green trucks or our green uniforms. Things like ecosystem services or climate change mitigation and adaptation, or most recently maybe ecological restoration. And in fact, the Pacific Southwest region, which we all refer to as Region 5, has a thing called Leadership Intent document. You can find it online, and in a presentation I'm giving tomorrow, I'll provide you the URL for that. I guess we could have provided some brochures along those lines. We could probably find them. Look at that. Okay, very cool. So one of the statements, it says that in that intent, that ecological restoration actually, this is verbatim, will be the central driver of wildland and forest stewardship in the Pacific Southwest region. That's a pretty big deal. Ecological restoration is defined by the Society for Ecological Restoration as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And like most agencies or institutions that have any sort of idea of self-worth, always add something. So we borrowed the SCR definition and added some stuff, and this is what we added. We say that restoration focuses on establishing the composition, structure, pattern, and ecological processes necessary to make ecosystems sustainable, resilient, and healthy under current and future conditions. That's a pretty tall order for any ecosystem, but at first glance, it can seem maybe almost impossible in a place like Southern California, where habitats are fragmented, where exotic species are ubiquitous, where the air is quite a bit thicker than where I usually live, where disturbance regimes have been profoundly altered, where human populations are growing and infrastructure and human communities are expanding. So in such an altered landscape, something like ecological restoration is a pretty daunting task. I mean, for example, how do you identify and how do you describe what would be a reference date set? I mean, this is a basic fundamental step in restoration. What constitutes reasonable or, say, appropriate or attainable goals or objectives? And how do you ensure the sustainability of this work into the future? So the unique nature of the restoration problem in Southern California led a group of us over, I guess, the last about 8 months or so, to discuss how we might best interpret and implement the national and regional focus on restoration on the national forests and adjoining lands dominated by shrubland landscapes, particularly in Southern California. And one of the outcomes of these deliberations has been the Chaparral Restoration Initiative, which Marty Dumpus will detail actually tomorrow. But another one was this workshop. So the purpose of the workshop, in the associated field trips that will be going on later in the week, or some of us will be going on later in the week, really are to summarize the general issue and to provide some insight into how we are actually assessing, implementing, and monitoring restoration opportunities in chaparral. But really, for me, probably most importantly, we thought it represented a unique opportunity to try to reunite a whole lot of different people and institutions from all corners of Southern California society that have got interests and concerns about chaparral management, about chaparral conservation and chaparral restoration. So really, in the end, our hope is that these few days we spend together will provide opportunities to network, to build collaborations, and maybe most importantly, provide some inspiration rather than maybe desperation, which I think maybe some of the current thinking is dominated by. But to provide us sort of a venue by which we can begin to work together to preserve and improve ecological conditions, chaparral-dominated landscapes across Southern California. So I don't know, we had an agenda that was up front, and the workshop is organized in 4 sections. So today we'll be dealing with section 1, which deals with defining the nature of the problem and how we actually assess restoration needs on the ground. And then tomorrow we'll begin with section 2, which is implementation, and that's in the morning. And then in the afternoon we have 2 shorter sections, one dealing with monitoring and another one dealing with restoration, planning, and coordination. So we were very fortunate to have, I don't know, about a 97% success rate in attracting our preferred speakers, which doesn't happen very often. And so I guess that speaks to the importance of the topic maybe, but it also speaks to the magnanimity of our presenters, and I thank you for coming. Thank you very much. So I just want to thank some folks before I give up the podium. I'd especially like to thank Ramon Vallejo from the University of Barcelona and the Center for Mediterranean Environmental Studies, who is an expert in the Mediterranean zone in shrubland and forest restoration. Yeah, as probably most of you know, California is sort of the center of the North American Mediterranean climate zone, and there are 5 geographic regions in the planet that share the same climate, and they share a lot more besides that. And for a lot of years, these similarities have allowed a lot of useful, some cases not so useful, but a lot of useful broad generalizations and comparisons to be made. And Ramon, I also want to note that Ramon's presence here, he's speaking, I think, 3 times, right? Ramon, something like that. I'm sorry. We're paying for you to be here, though, so I might ask you to speak 4 times. But his presence is made possible by the International Programs Office of the Forest Service in Washington, D.C. Also, I'd like to identify the members of the working group who worked so hard to pull this event together. So I want to start with Marty Dumpus, who's standing behind the camera in the back. Marty is the Regional Foresters Representative for Ecological Restoration in Southern California. I also want to recognize Dr. Jan Byers, who's here from Pacific Southwest Research Station in Riverside, and Dr. Marcia Marag as well from the Pacific Southwest Region, or Research Station, sorry, I almost said region, didn't I? In Riverside. I also want to thank Chris Noda and Sarah Sawyer. Chris is the Regional Foresters Representative in Sacramento, and Sarah Sawyer is the Assistant Regional Ecologist. They played an important role in making this event happen as well. And then finally, I just want to thank our host, the Angeles National Forest, and especially Tom Contreras and Jerry Sersky, who I think has driven every single kilometer or mile of all the field trips we're going to be doing in the next couple of days, which is pretty amazing. And also Dan O'Connor, Diane Travis, and Jennifer Hooper, who helped in organizing the trips and the workshop as well. And I know I've forgotten some people, and I'm sorry. Okay, with that, I'd like to introduce Jan Byers, who's going to moderate our first session. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. I've got to get the computer working. Sorry about that. I should have had you pushing the buttons on this to keep it awake while you were talking. All right. Let's see which one. So this session is on assessment of why do we need to restore chaparral? What's the problem? What's the magnitude? What are the issues involved? And how can we get it done? Our first speaker will be Dr. John Keeley, who's a research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey stationed at Sequoia National Park. He's been working in chaparral pretty much since forever. It's not quite, you're not that old, John. John earned his master's degree at San Diego State University, where I think he first started working in Chaparral, and then has a PhD in botany and ecology from the University of Georgia. Impressive credentials and research on Chaparral, and he's going to talk to us about the need for chaparral restoration. How did we get here?
Can we turn these lights down? Well, thank you, Jan, and Marcia and Hugh for organizing this and inviting me. Like Hugh, I'm from the Sierra Nevada, but I love to visit Southern California, with the emphasis on visit. I was just at a meeting in Alaska. They had two, is there a pointer on here? Oh, I see. Oh, yeah, they had two screens like this, and I thought it was really slick. The downside of it is, though, when the speaker is pointing on one of the screens, the other screen, the people don't get to see it. So I've got 2 pointers here. I don't know if I'm going to be able to pull this off. So we'll see. Okay, I'm going to kind of set the stage. This is what Hugh asked me to do, set the stage for the whole topic of restoration, why we need to be thinking about restoration, basically how we got here. And one of the things that's important to understand, the reason that he wants to explore this topic of how did we get here, is that restoration goals strive to return an ecosystem to some historical state or multiple states present in the past. But to do this, you need a reference condition, and you need some understanding of what historical conditions were like. There's not been a huge amount of interest in ecology to relate ecological patterns to historical events. One of the people who's done a number of papers and workshops in this area is Norm Christensen at Duke University. And one of the things that he always stressed is that to understand historical patterns of humans was critical if you were going to correctly interpret ecological patterns. And he was in North Carolina where there was tremendous human impacts that were very obvious. Now, we're going to focus on the history. Now, history is something that's very relative. What I'm going to be talking today about in history is the last 100, 200 years. In Ramon Vallejo's terms, that would be recent events because some parts of the world have had much longer human impacts. Now, one of the papers that I was always influenced by very early in my career, and there is a beginning date, it goes back to the early 70s, was a paper that Phil Wells did in 1962, in which he looked at the San Luis Obispo quadrangle and pointed out there's this mosaic of different vegetation types. Most of the brown there is annual grasslands, and then there's shrublands, woodlands that are all native. And he studied this distribution of the different vegetation types, and one of the things he concluded is the native vegetation types tended to have particular requirements in terms of being found on particular slope faces and soil types, whereas the grasslands, which are all dominated by non-native species, species that come from Ramon's part of the world, these species tended to be on all soil types, all slope faces, and his conclusion was that this was driven by past patterns of disturbance, and these patterns of disturbance would remove native vegetation, and these invasive animal plants from the Mediterranean took their place. His contention was that this disturbance began long before Europeans colonized this landscape. At least the pattern of disturbance, of course the alien species weren't here until the Europeans arrived, but the pattern of disturbance, he contends, started long before Europeans got here. Native Americans did a tremendous amount of disturbance on the landscape, and there's a lot of reason to believe they could have had huge impacts. One is California had very high population densities of Native Americans relative to many other parts of North America, so there were lots of people on this landscape. For example, this is the Santa Barbara region at the time of contact with Europeans, and most of the valleys that were livable had Native American communities in them. So there's a huge potential for impact on the landscape. Now, one of the most likely impacts would have been fire, because these landscapes are extremely fire prone, as we all know. And the other important thing is that the natural sources of emissions on these landscapes, like this is the Cleveland Los Padres Forest, and this is natural lightning ignitions per million hectares per year. The natural lightning ignitions are very low relative to, say, other parts of western US. So if you have low lightning ignitions and high human population densities, you have the potential for a big impact on changing natural fire regimes. And we have a lot of anecdotes in the literature suggesting that Native Americans did a fair bit of burning. In fact, it was really their primary means of land management was to ignite fires, and some of the early explorers described them as burning just about every opportunity they got. And in fact, the first fire ordinance was something that dates back to 1793, when the Spanish governor in the region declared that these natives could no longer light fires. Now, it's my belief that Native American burning, it's certainly in the central coastal region, has greatly subsidized natural lightning ignitions to the extent that patterns of grassland or open shrubland were significantly altered. And I think there's a lot of reasons to believe that, one of which is natural chaparral stand is generally not very suitable for humans for lots of different reasons. And in fact, if you've ever worked in chaparral, you understand why somebody would want to burn it. As one of my favorite botanists, Frank Bassick, said many years ago in a paper, he was studying mature chaparral, and he said some of these stands were so old and dense that he couldn't sample them without extreme epidermal abrasion. And I thought that was a very, very polite way of describing it. This is what it looks like after fire, and of course this is a very different environment if you have to depend on the land for subsistence. And there are a lot of reasons that we hypothesize why Native Americans might have been burning the landscape: increasing seed and bulk, fruit production, habitats for mammal resources, water resources. There's good evidence that the Native Americans could actually turn ephemeral streams into perennial streams by burning. Reducing hazardous conditions, not only chaparral being hazardous to wildfires when it's around communities, it also harbored grizzly bears, and so there were those reasons for burning, facilitate travel, and just a lot of other reasons that Native Americans might have burned. Now, how long has this impact been on the landscape? Well, we know with a fair degree of certainty that Native Americans have been in this part of the world since about the late Pleistocene, 11,000 years ago. That doesn't mean that they've had an impact that long, because the population densities undoubtedly were relatively low at that time, and very likely the real intense use of the landscape probably dates to about mid-Holocene, and it's evident in the change in the subsistence economy at that time, where the Native Americans basically went from using animal resources pretty widely to heavily being dependent on acorn production and other seed production. And it's suggested that this would coincide with an increase in human population density about maybe 5,000 years ago. And some people contend at the time of European contact that these Native Americans were living at or near the carrying capacity of their environment. So in other words, there were lots of reasons to think that they might have been manipulating their environment to increase resources. Now, one of the resources, a lot of annual and perennial species after fire produce copious seeds, much more so than the shrubs. And in fact, this is a common pattern throughout the world. When people move into woody vegetation, they generally displace it in favor of herbaceous vegetation because the seed resources are much better. One of the most commonly preferred species is chia, and chia seeds have the highest protein concentration of any of the California native species. They also burn to promote native tobacco, which they used for smoking. Now, one of the things that is learned very early on when you're working with fire, particularly in these shrubble systems, is that repeat fires are often very detrimental to chaparral, and they often result in a replacement of the woody vegetation with herbaceous vegetation. And this is illustrated by a study we did a number of years ago. This is a site that was out in the Santa Monica Mountains that burned, this one here burned, both of them burned in 1993. And this is the proportion of grass and forbs as a percent of total cover. And the site that burned in 1993 and didn't reburn over that time, the herbaceous vegetation dropped precipitously. This is a site, though, that burned in 93 and 96, and following that 96 burn, it went on a different trajectory, and herbaceous vegetation increased. And so by repeatedly burning sites, you can, in many sense, type convert the area from woody vegetation to herbaceous, because this site is very likely on a trajectory of continued herbaceous vegetation. Now, when Native Americans did this, these were native herbaceous species. Today, when this happens, almost inevitably the herbaceous species are non-native. One thing to keep in mind, though, about these patterns of the impact of fires on herbaceous cover is there's a big difference between where you're at on relative to the coast. Coastal sites tend to tolerate more disturbance, tend to tolerate more disturbance and persist in the than interior sites. And this is an illustration from a study done a number of years ago by John O'Leary at San Diego State. And this is basically coastal sage scrub, basically near the coast. And this is the shrub cover following a fire, plummets and then rises, and this is the herbaceous cover here. But on interior scrub sites, the pattern looks quite different. Herbs stay very high. We've done a number of studies seeing essentially the same patterns, that interior sites recover more slowly, they remain more heavily dominated by herbaceous species than coastal species. And it raises a problem with the whole terminology of coastal sage scrub. And so I've gone away from calling it coastal sage scrub and call it California sage scrub, because it gets kind of complicated when you compare coastal sage scrub with interior coastal sage scrub. Now, how much land was directly exploited by Native Americans? The answer is we really don't know. There's a lot of people who have speculated. Kroeber, who studied Native Americans probably longer than anyone else, considered no land in California completely uninhabited, but just rather varied in the intensity of utilization. Beals, another Native American scholar, suggested that only about 5% of the total area in California was unused by Native Americans. Cat Anderson goes even farther and says every part of the region had been discovered, walked, or settled by people by the time Spaniards first arrived. Now, that's on the outside, that seems a little excessive, but it's interesting because in a place like San Diego County, that has the highest density of Native American artifacts of any place in North America. There's something like 11,000 documented sites in San Diego County. So this may not be too far-fetched, even though it seems at the outset to be a little excessive. Now, once the Europeans got here, disturbance continued in a lot of it, both in terms of burning the landscape like we believe Native Americans did, but also bringing in livestock and intensively grazing the landscape. And in addition to bringing in the livestock, Europeans also brought in a whole new batch of herbaceous species, which displaced a lot of the native native herbaceous species. And in fact, it's my belief that the reason the exotics brought in by the Europeans beginning in the 1500s, but in earnest in the late 1700s. The reason they dominate the land so quickly, in fact, there's really no good documentation of the trajectory of non-native species invasions. When people first started thinking about it in the early 1800s, they were everywhere. And I think one of the reasons is because the Native Americans had been burning so extensively, the landscape was in sort of a quasi-equilibrium, and these exotics were basically well adapted to dealing with this disturbance regime that was already in place. Now, how do we calculate the amount of landscape that has been converted from woody shrubland vegetations to grasslands? We made a seat of the pants guess at this at one time, and our guess was probably about a quarter of chaparral vegetation that today is not developed is probably been converted from chaparral to grassland. And the thinking that goes into this is to look at the landscape in terms of what climate and soils would predict. And we have a lot of landscapes that have enough precipitation and have the right soil types to carry woody vegetation, that if they are currently in grassland vegetation, then our assumption is that those were likely areas that have been type converted from past disturbance. Now, that's dependent, though, on whether or not there's a natural historical disturbance cycle that would have kept them as an herbaceous vegetation. In coastal California, and this is in the Bay Area, where you see a lot of mosaics of grassland and woody vegetation, and in the absence of disturbance, there's good reason to believe that most of that landscape would have been woody vegetation, but has been converted to grasslands from disturbance. And the reason we believe that this is not due to past historic or natural disturbance cycles is that natural disturbance cycles are relatively, particularly fire, were relatively limited in the Bay Area, in fact throughout the Coast Ranges. And in fact, today we're seeing in the Bay Area a lot of reversion of grasslands to shrublands when you remove disturbance from the landscape. This is a 1951 paper from the Oakland Hills showing a mosaic of grasslands and shrublands. And this is that same image in 1994 where it's filled in with all these shrubs. It's commonly referred to as shrub encroachment, but that's probably not the correct term. It's probably best to think of it as shrub recolonization, because these are landscapes that very likely were originally dominated by woody vegetation. And the reason we believe that natural disturbance cycles didn't maintain them as grasslands is if you look at the natural lightning fire frequency in the Bay Area relative to interior area, for example, these are Plumas National Forest, Sequoia, and and the dark bars here being lightning fires, the hatch bars being human fires, and these are Bay Area counties here. Basically, the Bay Area is dominated by human fire, very little lightning-ignited fires. So we don't believe grasslands were ever maintained there by natural fires. It would have been due to humans that were igniting fires and promoting disturbance on that landscape. And another clue we have of this is there have been some studies in the Bay Area in these grasslands where they looked at microfossils known as phytoliths. Phytoliths are these silicate-type cells which are produced by grasses, and when they're present, you can tell that the sites used to be grasslands. And they looked at a number of these grasslands going back several hundred years, and they find that the grasslands are relatively recent, that these phytoliths drop out pretty quickly in the depth. Now, let's talk about more contemporary impacts on fire regimes and potential for type conversion on our landscape. This is a figure from Hugh Safford, and this is some really great work that he's done looking at the fire departure index for Southern California forests. And the idea is, okay, let's look at the past century of burning and compare it to what we think was happening prior to European colonization of the landscape. And then we'll calculate how that landscape departs from the historical condition. And in this case, blue represents burning too often, although I wish you would have made that red, because red burning more frequently seems more appropriate, but at any
I'll explain
rate.
that to you later.
Okay. Blues here indicate areas that have burned way too often on the landscape relative to what we believe the historical patterns were. Reds here mean they're not burning enough. And basically what he's shown is that essentially the higher elevation conifer forests are sites that historically burn more frequently, and in contemporary terms, they're not burning nearly as much as they used to. The lower foothills, chaparral, and other non-forested landscapes have been burning way too often, much more than historically was the case. And this is shown in a Forest Service publication a number of years ago, looking at the time since the last fire, the amount of the landscape in foothills versus montane areas. And the forests have a lot of landscape that's gone a long time without a fire. Foothills have far less landscape that's gone a long time without fire. Now, one of the problems in terms of type conversion with shrublands then is getting too much fire. And I've described ways that happen intentionally by burning a landscape for management purposes, but it can also happen due to serendipity. And this is an illustration of two series of wildfires in San Diego County in 2003, 2007, where there's a tremendous amount of overlap in burning. The green hash bars here, this perimeter represents the 2003 fires. This is the big Cedar fire from 2003. The yellow represents 2007 fires. You can see where the Witch fire overlapped with the Cedar fire. And those perimeters represent, for these three big sets of fires, they represent about 60,000 acres that at least the area within the perimeter burned. But we don't necessarily mean that every square acre in those overlaps burn. And in fact, typically when we look at these sorts of things, we see that maybe 20 or 30% of the area within a perimeter didn't burn at all. But at any rate, a substantial amount of that landscape is put at risk for too much fire. And what happens when you get too much fire? This is an illustration here. This landscape from near Alpine in San Diego County, all burned in the Laguna fire in 1970. This portion of the landscape burned again in 2001 by the Viejas fire. And then this portion of the landscape burned a third time in the Cedar fire. Here we see mature chaparral. Here we see the natural cirral stage of chaparral, like 4 or 5 years after a fire. Mostly all natives, ephemeral species. And this represents an area dominated by Bromus mandricensis and a lot of other non-native species. So you get too many fires, and in fact, it's not usually just too many fires, in fires that are very close together. In this case, 2 fires that are just a few years apart. And this just illustrates what happens in terms of the vegetation in the area burned under what we might think was a natural fire return interval, dominated by native species. This area with 3 fires dominated by Bromus mandricensis. So that is the reason we're concerned about too many fires. Another way of looking at it is a study that Teresa Brennan and I did recently, where we looked at areas burned in, areas burned in the 2003-2007 fires, and looked at it in 2 ways. One is after the 2003 fires, there were areas that were only 3 years of age at the time of the fire, and there were other areas that were 24 years of age at the time of the fire. And this is what you see in terms of aliens on the landscape after those 2 events. Aliens dominate the sites if the fire occurs on 3-year-old vegetation. Aliens are a very minor part if you burn a 24-year-old stand. So the age of the vegetation at the time of the fire is really important in determining the aliens on those landscapes. And when we talk about aliens, you can think of that as equivalent as going from woody vegetation to herbaceous vegetation, because most of our aliens are herbaceous species. Another way of looking at it is areas that were burned in 2003 and then burned again in 2007. This is the recovery of natives and aliens after the 2003 fires on sites that were all mature at the time of the fire. And then this is the alien dominance on those same sites when they were burned again in 2007 versus the non-native cover. So by repeatedly burning sites today, and it could be intentionally or it could be by accident or by arson, the effect on this type conversion to herbaceous species is the same. And this will lay out for you all the parameters you need to worry about in terms of understanding alien dominance. But I'll just point out a couple features of this rather complex model. Alien dominance, and this is measured 5 years after a fire, is dependent largely on whether there's aliens there before the fire. And whether or not there's aliens there before the fire is a function of a lot of things, but not, particularly important is fire history. And that fire history, if fires have been real common in the past, it'll affect fire intensity, which also has an impact. And then the other important thing that determines alien dominance 5 years after a fire is how fast the canopy closes in. So we can think of this as sort of a race after a fire between the aliens getting there and the shrubs closing back in. Because once they close in their canopy, there's much less threat of aliens persisting. This is another interesting way of looking at the alien problem. It illustrates that there's a number of things that affect alien dominance on burn sites. And one is the stand age at the time of the fire. The stands are very young, like down here. Alien cover will be very high. Older stands, much less alien dominance. And fire severity is another parameter that affects aliens. Not surprisingly, old sites tend to have the highest severity, and they have the lowest alien invasion. And so we often think of high severity fires as somehow being detrimental to the system. In Chaparral, it actually works the other way. Low severity fires are detrimental because low severity fires tend to occur in younger stands, and those younger stands tend to have more aliens move into them. This is looking at burn severity and recovery of the vegetation, and it just illustrates that the native vegetation is actually quite resilient to a wide range of fire severity. So that fire severity is, it can be very, very high, and yet it has relatively little impact on post-fire cover of the native vegetation. So the way to think about this is chaparral is resilient to a wide range of fire severities, and it will recover very well whether severity is high or low. Aliens, on the other hand, very sensitive to high severity fires, and they recover or dominate usually when sites are relatively young at the time of the fire. Now, one of the things that's also interesting is the severity of the fire, which is usually a function of age, can have an impact in ways that are somewhat counterintuitive. For example, this is fire severity here, and this is obligate cedar density of mostly Ceanothus species after a series of fires. And one of the things you see is those obligate cedars tend to do very, very well the more severe the fire is. And part of the reason for that is obligate cedars need a period of time to produce a seed bank, and so they can recover after a fire. Low severity fires tend to be younger, and those sites very often don't have sufficient seed bank. High severity fires tend to be typical of older stands, and those are the stands that have the highest seed banks, and in this case, the best recovery of vegetation. And this just illustrates seedling recruitment after fire for Ceanothus. They tend to dominate, and these are obligate seeding species, at least most of those. And they dominate in the first year after fire, and then for the next 5 years, basically no seedling recruitment. But these species don't resprout, and as a result, if you burn them too frequently before they've had time to replenish the seed bank, then they're at risk. Now, we have other species that are obligate seeders that are at risk too, if fire return intervals are too close. For example, Cupressus forbesii, and is that still forbesii?
I believe Jefferson's in the left.
It doesn't matter. This is a Serotinus cypress species that tends to occur in fairly dense stands, produces Serotinus cones, and they depend on fire to open and recruit. And this is a typical pattern of what you see when you look at different stand ages on a log scale here, and the density on those sites. And basically, the younger sites, after there's been a fire and there's been lots of seeds dumped in the soil, density is very high, and then there's this natural thinning with age. But if sites are young at the time of the fire, these are sites that were 7 years of age, they have very few cones, and very often recruitment is threatened if fires are too frequent in those stands. And this is illustrated here, sites that were 7 years of age at the time of fire, and this is the post-fire seedling density. And in this case, highest density were middle-aged stands. So species like Cupressus, which are relatively sensitive to disturbance, can be very much affected if fires are too frequent. Another species that's of interest, particularly on the Angeles, is Pseudotsuga macrocarpa, big Douglas fir, occurs in isolated stands. It's not serotinous, and it should be able to deal with fire pretty well because it actually sprouts epicormically, which is a very rare trait in conifers. But it's very sensitive to site conditions at the time of the fire, and not all the stands will sprout. And this is an illustration from a study we did a long time ago on the Angeles. And this is one site here, the dark bars indicate live trees after the fire, and open bars, dead trees after a fire. And here's a site where a lot of them survived and resprouted. Here's a site where not a single tree resprouted. And one of the big differences, and I don't know how general this is, but I suspect it is, the big difference was in the degree of slope. This was a relatively gentle slope, and this was a very steep slope. And I think on the very gentle slopes, basically fuel accumulation perhaps results in much more intense fires, whereas on the slopes, there's less fuels, and that's where they survive. And you might think of a model for this species of one in which it persists in refugia on very steep slopes, and in the absence, long absence of fire, it's capable of moving out into other areas and persists there for a while until a fire comes back and then shrinks into these refugia. Now, the last thing I'll just mention is something about fuel treatments and how they potentially might affect the invasion of species into chaparral. There's lots of different types of fuel treatments that we can talk about on a field trip. Mastication is one in which our lab, and headed up by Teresa Brennan here, have been focused on looking at mastication on the Angeles and a number of other forests for a couple of reasons. One, we want to know what the effect is on fire behavior of masticated fuels, but then we're also interested in the effects on species composition. And one of the things that's real clear is in masticated areas, you generally don't get many of the endemic species that come up after fire. And we have a little bit of data showing a masticated area adjacent to a recent burned area. In fact, it was burned because of a masticator igniting a fire. And so it's a nice ad hoc experiment. But one of the things you'll find when you compare masticated and burned areas is the masticated sites generally lack the post-fire endemic species. The other thing about fuel breaks is that they tend to be linear arrays or areas where potentially invasive species can move along them into perhaps areas further away from civilization than normally. And then once they're in there, they have the potential of moving off the fuel break into native vegetation. And this is just a study we did a number of years ago, looking at relative native cover and distance from a fuel break versus numbers of fires. And so basically, when you have lots of fires on a fuel break area, you have much greater potential for those aliens to move from the fuel break, because they often dominate there, but move into the native vegetation. And of course, this is an issue that is a concern when we think about things like clearance and defensible zones, is it does have the potential for negative resource impacts. It doesn't mean that it's not something that should be done, but it means that it needs to be evaluated in the context of resource sacrifice and potential resource damage. And I'll just end it there, because this is the fire line for restoration. I'm happy to answer any questions, everybody. Yeah.
When you're masticated, when you're looking at masticated areas, how are you finding that that your chaparral and scrub species recover as opposed to the way they recover after fire? In other words, have you been on a masticated site long enough to see a recovery or lack of recovery pattern?
Actually, I should Cass Brennan, who's here
Just see
somewhere.
back here, I didn't quite hear the question.
Is probably the better person to answer this, because see, we haven't analyzed the data. It's a 3-year study, and but she might have a feel. The question is how does recovery of the native woody vegetation appear on masticated sites relative to, say, burn sites?
A lot of them, it's actually recovering about the same. You see a lot more of that vigorous resprouting on the fire sites. Masticated sites, it's not quite as vigorous, but given a little bit more time and no extra fire, it looks about the same. But some of the sites that are remasticated, then you start losing that shrub component altogether and you get a lot more exotic. So the amount of aliens in multiple mastications doubles from what I'm seeing so far. I'm in the process of analyzing this. Hope to get some stuff out soon that you can actually get some real numbers on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Whenever you use the two terms fire intensity and fire severity, you define what's so far is often different.
Fire
Science
intensity,
different.
yeah, the way intensity in most fields is defined is it's usually an amount of energy generated per unit of time. So it's generally restricted to defining the heat of the fire or the fire line intensity of the flame lengths. In other words, some physical measure of the fire which relates to energy production by the fire. Now, when you study wildfires, generally we don't know anything about fire intensity, although we're developing remote imaging techniques for getting at that. But generally, we don't know anything about the intensity. And so, as a result, ecologists and foresters have developed the term burn severity or fire severity, which is thought of as a surrogate for fire intensity. And it represents basically a measurement of the biomass loss. And so above ground is how much of the biomass that was there on the site before the fire has been lost or charred, as well as the biomass in the soil, because many of the soil characteristics that are used to define burn severity are measures of organic matter loss in the soil. So it's a surrogate for fire intensity that could be obtained after a fire.
Thank you, John. We're going to have a discussion session for about 20 minutes, half an hour after the next speaker, so there will be lots more chances to ask questions. Okay, let's see if I can find it. There we go. All right, our next speaker is Dr. Steve Davis from Pepperdine University. And Steve is a distinguished professor of biology. He's won numerous teaching awards for his academic excellence, as well as his ability to involve students in research and come up with some great projects. And he's worked on chaparral for almost as long as John Keeley, or maybe longer.
Not that long.
Not that long. Anyway, he's done a lot of great work in chaparral as well. And do you got that? The microphone there. Okay. So, Steve brought some props as well as slides, and so, take it away.
I've always wanted to wear one of these. Phantom of the Opera, you know. I see those guys, so my first time, I don't know how to prop it up right, but we'll get started here. Yeah, I do need props. It's always helpful. We're going to talk about some of the issues that deal with the biology. We're going to move from the landscape that John set us up on down to individual organisms and even some of the physiology and how the cells function in these organisms. And I thought I would start with a classical monograph by Cooper, 1922. He did this work near the Stanford University campus. It's now called Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve. He did it for the Carnegie Institute of Washington. And he defined chaparral, good starting point. And he says chaparral is dominated by many species belonging to genera unrelated taxonomically, but of a single constant ecological type. That's what it appeared to him going into the classical study. Especially the root system that's extensive. So I brought a little root system here, and there it is. There's the root crown. Some people call it a lignon tuber. And here's the root. And I picked the smallest one I could find of Melasma lorina, because if I got one that was about 10 feet across, no way could I get it through the door or could I carry it. But if you see this close up, Marcia will tell you there are little knobs, little bumps on this root crown. Those are adventitious buds. It's like a giant potato below the soil surface, and it's insulated from the high temperature fire, and it will sprout pretty quickly. We had a fire 4 or 5 weeks ago, and the sprouts are already about a foot tall. So pretty remarkable. Now what's interesting, we've measured roots on at least 2 species that go down over 40 feet on this one. And here's what the top looks like. And the co-dominant plant on our campus, we excavated 2 of them, went down a little over 5 feet. So you can't assume that all have incredibly deep roots, extensive. Number 2, the dense, rigid branching is pretty remarkable. This is Ceanothus megacarpus. That's a co-dominant, used to be anyway, with Melasma lorina on our campus. And if you take the stems and try to break them, this one is really stiff. It's very hard to break. It's made of high density, has a high modulus of rupture, high modulus of elasticity. We measured all of that. This one is easily broken. Very, very good. This one has big conduits, big vessels, high hydraulic conductivity, easily broken. This one has a lot of wood density invested in the fibers that make it strong. So dense, rigid branching, that's variable. Now the leaf, which is small, thick, heavily cutinized, and evergreen. Now these look pretty much like the same plant. You notice that? Here's our Melasma lorina. And you notice the leaves on that? Does it look like the leaves on this one? Co-dominants. Are all the leaves the same? They're different sizes. Now these look pretty much the same. I think it makes you hungry for tacos. And a folded leaf, right? And we even have an international colleague here who will give us an objective advice on this. I'll pull a leaf off of this one. There you go, that's Melasma lorina. These are all in the Anacardaceae. Here's a leaf off Rhus ovata. And are those leaves exactly the same? They look the same. What do you think? They're not the same. This one's thicker. The cuticle is thicker. All the way from Barcelona, Spain, independent, international expert picking out the difference in these leaves. We couldn't explain the biology of these 2. This one is incredibly freezing tolerant, goes down to negative 18 degrees Celsius, has big vessels, they cavitate and embolize, it should die, it doesn't, we couldn't figure it out. This one, the leaves die and the stems die. Well, what my student did, they pulled off both leaves, sealed the ends with wax, put them in a drying chamber, and these were dead within 24 hours. This one went 5 days. You can't assume they're all alive. You'll notice this one, the interior, near Sonoran Desert, in very cold areas. This one doesn't get in cold areas or dry areas. Okay, so the point is the definition of chaparral that was classically given was very remarkable in that day. But what I would suggest is we're dealing with diversity, many species, but don't assume they're a single constant ecological type. And that's my primary point. We're dealing with restoration of chaparral, but it's really restoration of biodiversity. There are different niches, diversity of habitat, microsites, diversity of life history type, whether seedling, adult, or resprout. It's dependent on whether or not they're post-fire sprouters or not, post-fire seeders or not, and diverse adaptations they have to survive summer drought, wildfire, and even freezing temperatures. So here's an example. I took this in this winter. This is the Santa Monica Mountains. The plants are in bloom. Ceanothus megacarpus. That's this plant right here in bloom. You can pick it out. And here is the west end of Catalina Island. That's the only one we could find right there. And you talk about restoration of the west end of Catalina Island. And this goes back a long ways. Could be Native American. Could be goats and pigs that are finally eradicated from the island. But we still have exotic animals called deer that graze on them. And we're doing the genetics of pepperdine on this plant. Sarah Rattay helped us. And in actuality, we have some evidence that across subgenera, they're forced to hybridize. Where are you going to find a partner when you're that isolated? Very low density. Okay, so biological considerations. Why do chaparral species grow where they do? And how are they adapted to environmental stress? And we're in a remarkable location in Southern California. That is, you can be guaranteed 6 to 9 months you're not going to have rainfall in Southern California, at least in Malibu where we are. It's always sunny. And because of that, if you're an evergreen plant that keeps those green leaves on throughout that many months of drought, they've got to be drought tolerant and have adaptations to do that. For example, this one right here is a Ceanothus species. The number we measure on that is negative 11 megapascals. That's the water status of it. Put that in reference. Most crop plants at negative 1.1 megapascal to 1.5 will wilt. This plant right here is 10 times drier than that. And it is, the branches are dying, but the reason they're dying, I'm sorry, did I do that? I got too excited. Am I going the right direction here?
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry about that. Oh, I gave everything away here. I'll put that thing down. I get too nervous, okay? I don't know why. But anyway, what happens with these plants? They're evergreen leaves. They got to keep those things on and keep them supplied for 6 to 9 months without rainfall. But the leaves still use water regardless. And the roots can't make it up fast enough. Therefore, in the xylem, that water comes under tension. And that tension can be measured. And eventually, if its tension is great enough, like negative 11 megapascal, it will suck air in. Now you have a problem. Now you have an air bubble. And that's a physical blockage. It's called an embolism. And if there's air in there, water can get to that leaf and it dies. And you're seeing it right here. Those branches are dying due to cavitation and embolism. We have a paper demonstrating that. Number 2, wildfire. When I came to Pepperdine University in 1974, the fire frequencies on average was among the highest in the Santa Monica Mountains. We could study fire every 12 years. I'm sorry to tell you that now it's shorter. It's averaged about every 8 years because of arson and because of accidents. So if you want to study fire effects on plants and potential for vegetation type conversion, etc., our campus is a pretty good place to do it. Lastly, freezing. What's amazing about freezing is that on our campus, we're near the ocean. It ameliorates changes in temperature. It never freezes. It's always down to -0 about as low as it gets. Just 4 kilometers, just a few miles inland, it goes to -12. And so if you're into plant distribution and what controls it, it's not primarily drought. It's not primarily wildfire. But in our case, it's a freezing gradient. And the dominant species on our campus, and I have 3 of them here. One is Melasma lorina, I've shown you. The other is Ceanothus megacarpus, one of the white blossoms, I've shown you. And the third one fell on the ground, Ceanothus spinosus. These are the 3 dominants, at least they used to be, on the campus. And what happens is you go 3 miles inland, and they're gone. You can't find them. And the reason is it's too cold. They can't handle freezing, and therefore they're eliminated from those sites. Okay, also their interactions, adding to the complexity. Sorry to tell you this. Here's a picture of Malibu Canyon right next to our campus. And this is in the winter of 2007. We had an unusual event, the driest year on record, 3.4 inches. And because those plants were dry, we also had a temperature that dropped down to around -11 at some summers. And what that does is, when you freeze thaw, you cause bubbles. And if you have dry plants, it expands the bubbles when they thaw, and it enhances embolism, enhances kill. You see a lot of dead plants in this picture? Those are all Melasma lorina. So drought interacted with freezing, and then in October, a little telephone pole blew over in a Santa Ana wind, and guess where the fire started? In the Malibu fire. Had a lot of nice dry fuel. So these things do interact. It relates to anthropogenic effects, it relates to climate change, and it relates to what may be more frequent occurring in Southern California. Okay, as far as drought effects, how do you measure plant water status? I've talked about it. We use the term water potential and simply a measure of the tension on the xylem in the stem. And a good reference here is that if it's wet, it's 0. If it's dry, it's like -10. And our reference point is pure water, was set at 0. And what's neat about this is a scale from 0 to -10. And if you want to know where a corn plant wilts, it's -1.5. It will wilt. At -2, it will die. So you want to see where chaparral are on the scale? Isn't that remarkable? If you want to study plant-water relations and get the whole smorgasbord, the whole spectrum, probably chaparral is one of the best systems to look at. And these chaparral shrubs scale some species here, others go all the way to -10. So how do chaparral shrubs compare to vegetation in drier sites? I always encounter this question. How about the Sonoran Desert? How about the Mojave Desert? How about the coastal sage scrub? California coastal sage, what I'm supposed to call that? Okay. So Anna Jacobson, one of my former students, actually compared chaparral, the coastal sage scrub, to the Mojave Desert. And she looked at this scale of 0 to -10, remember that scale? And this one shows where the xylem actually dysfunctions. It falls apart, about 50% failure. Psi 50 is water potential at 50% hydraulic failure. Just like, how toxic is it? Does it cause 50% kill? You know it's toxic when 50% of your little white rats are dying. Okay? So same thing we're doing with plants here. And notice, full spectrum for chaparral. Here's our Melasma lorina right there. Got the extreme, growing side by side with Ceanothus megacarpus right there. Oops. I gotta do better with that. So those are extremes within the chaparral. Notice the coastal sage is not the extreme, nor Mojave Desert. And if you look at the summary data, chaparral is significantly more drought tolerant based on susceptibility to cavitation in the area. So it's a great place to look for drought tolerance, water stress survival. Okay, chaparral, some are non-sprouters, others are sprouters. John used the term obligate seeders. Sorry to do that to you. Should have changed my slides if I had known he was going to do that. But a non-sprouter, if it doesn't sprout, is obliged to seed after fire. So chaparral, post-fire, the way they recover from fire, either the non-sprouters or sprouters. And these are the three species I've talked about: Ceanothus megacarpus, Ceanothus spinosus, Melasma lorina. Here's a photograph of them side by side: Ceanothus megacarpus, Melasma lorina. And you'll notice that one is sprouting after the fire, the other is not. Here's where our campus is located in the Santa Monica Mountains. Actually, it's kind of an island with an ocean one side and 13 million people on the other sides. See a little point sticking out there? That's pretty close to where Pepperdine is. Pepperdine's right here. And this is where Tony Stark's house is. Not much left of it after Iron Man 3, but if you wanted to see that, here it is. That's Point Doom right there, Tony Stark's house. Here's our campus. Here's that Melasma lorina right here. And then we have the Ceanothus spinosus in the middle, and then the white blossoms, the Ceanothus megacarpus. So it's pretty nice that these are the codominants, the way it used to look back when the Native Americans were there. And it no longer looks like that because of short fire return. Here's a student of mine, Kelly Bezerites, standing right here. You can see the plants are about the same height. You would assume that maybe the roots go down the same depth. One way to measure that indirectly, here's our scale, 0 to -10. This is the summer drought. April, May, June, July, August, September, October was a dry month. Have high fire frequency in October, okay. And notice, Ceanothus megacarpus down to -8. Ceanothus spinosus, -5. Melasma lorina doesn't get below that -1.5. So would you assume that all of these have extensive root systems that go way down? Indirectly, this guy should have deep roots. We've estimated over 40 feet on the two of these. Look at the root cuts. This one, about 5 feet, what we've excavated. Now we've used a stable isotope analysis, look at functional rooting depth and all of that. But the old tried and old true way is to try to excavate these things. And you see Colin Thomas, this is a big root, he's holding it in his hand, he's down there 18 feet. That's why we had to go to those guys. So they aren't all deep rooted, some tap the water table, others don't. And so you're looking at incredible diversity when you're looking at the restoration of chaparral. Okay, I'll just say a few things about fire. Here's a picture, and you can see that little nose sticking out, Tony Stark's house, Pepperdine there. That's the fire of 2003, followed by the worst drought in record, 2002, but that record was broken in 2007. A few fires. Our campus experienced the worst drought in record in 2007, followed by 3 fires on or adjacent to campus. January 5th, 2007, notice that was January, middle of winter. October 21st, 2007, November 24th, 2007. So it's one thing to look at it from outer space, the other when you're on campus, seeing potential study sites. We can go out and we can, I know I get in all kind of trouble because of this, but there's always pluses and minuses, right? We go out and tag the seedlings as they emerge using little colored shish kebab skewers and multiple quadrats. And we can follow the seedlings as they come up. Here's that Melasma lorina, see the big leaves, that curled leaf. And here's your Ceanothus megacarpus. Now I'm trying to remember, was this, did you say this was pretty thin and easily dried out? Bingo, see that? Which one do you think is going to survive the drought here? This is the end of the drought. Here's that Melasma lorina, doesn't look too good. That one doesn't look too good, but it's still green. And they have big differences in water stress tolerance as a result. And we think it's due to cavitation and embolism resistance. So what we did is we looked at survivorship. We looked at both the seedlings, the S means seedlings, Melasma lorina seedling, Ceanothus spinosus seedling, Ceanothus megacarpus seedling. We looked at it years after the fire. We also looked at the resprout. R means resprout, resprout. So here's Melasma lorina. It looks like 100% of those that burn resprout, and then 99% survive. And trust me, we're still following this 20 years later. there's still 99% out there. We measure this every week. In the case of Ceanothus spinosus, it doesn't have quite as many that successfully resprout. I lost my plant. It keeps jumping on the floor. Okay. And it's down to about 70 here, and just trust me, now it's down to about 30. So there's different responses at time, species specific. If you look at seedlings, man, there's a real story here. Here's John's obligate cedar. I call it a non-sprouter. Obligate cedar, those seedlings have incredibly high survivorship, and they can make it because they're incredibly drought tolerant. In contrast, the seeds of this, 99% mortality, and it appears that when you look at nature, it has great diversity, even though they are co-dominant species out there. Some are very susceptible to water stress and die, the seedlings die, but they have an incredible root that's tapping into the water table, and they sprout within a week after fire, and that's a strategy to make it. So it makes it on resprout success, the champion resprout success. With the other species that are co-dominant, none of them sprout. They're non-sprouters. They're obligate seeders. But those seedlings are incredibly hardy. They exploit the open canopy areas, the driest areas. If you grow them in shade, they're not going to do well. We've done the experiment at high mortality in the shade. These, as Ramon points out, these do well in the shade. They like those kind of conditions because they're susceptible. Okay, so great diversity. We've actually measured susceptibility to cavitation and embolism. And the way we do this, we just let the plants lay out on the table for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days as they do. Remember our scale from 0 to -10? There's a negative sign there. As the plants dry out, they start to lose their ability to conduct water. We call that % loss of conductivity. They're getting air bubbles in there. And here, there's no problem. They're not too dry. But if they go up here, 80% occlusion, they're going to die. And you see Melasma lorina, very susceptible to drying out. Ceanothus megacarpus, incredibly resistant. In fact, this guy has the record for an angiosperm. Not a gymnosperm, but an angiosperm. Right on our campus. And it's partly because these chaparral shrubs are evergreen. They have to go through 6 to 9 months. Okay? So pretty remarkable. And notice how this compares with the previous data I showed you. This is simply seasonal water potential. The plants will dry out as the drought progresses, and the Ceanothus megacarpus is the driest. Melasma lorina remains the wettest, relates to rooting depth, and it corresponds to their susceptibility to xylem dysfunction, embolism. Okay, what determines cavitation resistance? I think I'll go through this a little too fast, but it's not too critical. This gets down to the cells. We think it's the size of the pores in the cell walls. And here's a pipe, we call it a vessel. It has to have pores in the cell wall, get water in and transport to the leaves. And the big thread is the size of the pore in that cell wall, because if there's air here, it will suck air in, causing an embolism. And the way we test that, we can test it in several different ways. One way is we just let the plants dry out and look at increase in cavitation. The other is we built torpedo-like tubes and injected air into hydrated plants to see if we can duplicate that theory. And then lastly, we actually used a centrifuge to test this. So here are the plants dehydrating. And here's our increase in embolism, loss of conductivity. Notice this is Hollywood at Aroma intervitifolia. Got a nice leaf on it. Here's an air injection of those big torpedoes. So we have a hydrated plant. We're artificially building up pressure, see if we can force air in. And it seems to correspond. And then the ultimate, we took an old centrifuge. We built a rotor, so we put woody stems in the centrifuge. Dial in the RPM and get that thing to spin. You can calculate the negative pressure in the center of the stem. And that's the curve we got. So we're pretty confident these things we measure in these plants work. You can measure in at least 3 different ways. Okay, so that brings us to freezing. As I mentioned earlier, probably the main factor controlling the distribution of these species, where we are, is freezing temperature. Just over this ridge, by the way, this is sort of a MASH site in Tapia Park. You guys see, you guys are MASH fans? Okay, get you oriented, you know, Tony Sark, MASH, whatever it takes. Okay, the plants up here, they're flowering early, and then they flower down here. And initially, these species, trust me, are Ceanothus megacarpus, Ceanothus spinosus, Melanzia, just like on our campus. But down here it gets really cold. The dense air gets down to -12. When you get down here, these are different species. Ceanothus cuneatus, Ceanothus crassifolius, and Bucephalus. This one leaves injury at -19.